All right, so the book of Job is the third piece of wisdom literature, and it's very different from the first two in the fact that it's really a story and not just some guy kind of explaining how smart he is or the cool things that he knows or whatever it is that we can say about the first two. It's much different in its form, and it really deals with a guy who kind of goes through all of the things that the first two talk about. We have a guy who's doing all the right things. He's following the book of Proverbs to a T. In fact, you might be able to just follow him around and write the book of Proverbs, right? And yet all the things, all the calamities of Ecclesiastes kind of fall on him. And there's a trying to wrestle with this problem of life that happens in the midst of this unfolding story. If we take the beginning of this story and how these calamities come to fall on Job, what do we learn about the nature of this interplay between the Proverbs world of if A then B and the Ecclesiastes world of it's just all random?
The if A then B has been in operation in Job's life for a long time, and then in a single instant, all of it is undone, by a confluence of events.
There seems to be some real touch point with reality right there, because that seems to be the way that it often happens. You have a guy going along in life, and man, if he loves the Lord, or if he does what the Lord says, then he's going to get this. If he does A, then B is going to happen. And really, kind of that is the crux of the problem and why all the things fall on Job. If you look at Satan and the way he goes to God, he says, look, Job's not doing this for you. He's doing this because if A, then B, right? And he wants B. So then a new variable gets thrown in the mix, and that variable seems to be love to me. And why might love be the variable here that's not being taken into account? There's a mechanical view of the universe, right? If I do A, B happens. If I put my quarter in the slot, then I get the candy bar.
Right.
The machine doesn't love me. I don't love it. All of a sudden, we have this new variable thrown in, and I'll call it love. But why might love be a good word for it? Why? How come I'm right? Answer my question.
Because you get a steadfastness in this attitude of Job that is completely severed from the consequences of an if A then B kind of a situation.
Right. It's really kind of an interesting way that this gets set up is that in A and B world, it's a very mechanical. And really one of the aspects of love that makes love is its willingness to sacrifice, right? You as a parent, you understand the limitations of the
Sure.
if A then B world, because you take your newborn baby home, and if baby's crying A, then you give it a bottle B, right? And does that always work?
Right.
No,
Of course not.
it sure
Of course
doesn't.
not.
And you just sometimes the only thing to do is to suffer.
Yeah.
And to me, there's something really fantastic about that. Why might God design the world this way? Because it seems to not make a whole lot of sense, but I think there's a certain glory to it.
Well, I think it's a certain reflection of him, love never comes without suffering. It is built into it. And if you're going to, rest your desire for good and affections on anything else other than yourself, there's going to be some suffering and there's going to be some sacrifice that comes with it. And I think that's a perfect reflection of God. Why create a world that's going to cost him something, and yet he does?
I'd like to add a slight clarification to the book of Proverbs, and maybe this won't be included, but even though Proverbs has an A then B kind of situation, there's a whole lot of Proverbs that talks about what God, it describes God and what he loves and hates. And so there's this present current throughout the entire book of God and his character. Not just the stuff we can infer from the A and B part, but I mean, it outright says these are the things God hates, these are the things that God loves. So there's a whole lot more. And I think maybe the connection I'm making here in Job is there's this undercurrent of God's presence at all times. We get to see part of him interacting with Satan that I think is manifesting kind of the stuff through Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. I hadn't thought of that before.
Yeah, it is kind of a culmination of both
Yeah.
the books kind of
Yeah.
put together. And there really is, in the charge of Satan, there is a question that has to be answered, which is, does Job love you, or does he just love what you do for him?
Yeah.
And that is the ultimate question, right? I mean, does God love us, or does he just love what we do for him? Do we love him, or do we just love what he does for us? Yeah. The question, the proof of love, I mean, you can't look at the cross and not see that the ultimate proof of love is in the willingness to suffer. Because really, how else do you sort out selfishness from love? Because for a long time, they can look exactly the same, right? I mean, how many relationships between men and women start with, oh, I love you so much, I love you so much, this is so great, you know, this is so great, this is so great, and then turn out to be, you know, I'm likely to kill you if you don't leave my presence in this moment. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah, but how often is a relationship really just self-serving and not
right.
sacrificial for the other?
Right, and the person who's saying all these things, I love you, I love you, I love you, they believe that they're loving the person, but in reality, all they're really loving is the feeling that they get from that person. Their love is not about the other person; it's about the way that that other person makes them feel. It's about the ego boost that the other person gives them. It's about, they might not even realize that that's what's happening, but you call on that person to suffer, and all of a sudden things get clarified very quickly. And so there's this, you know, there seems to be this other variable, and I think that variable is love, that gets thrown into the mix. And so the question for Job really is going to point in that direction, even though it's not so neatly contained. Now, Job has some friends that show up who have all kinds of great advice, and how would we summarize that great advice?
Well, before
A, B.
yeah, let's not forget his wife too.
Yes.
Curse God and die.
Right, exactly.
Thanks, wife. But you were saying.
Yeah, they have a very if A then B kind
Yeah.
of view of the world, and
Right.
And obviously, if this is where you're at, well, then
You didn't do it.
you had some miscalculations.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You've done something, and
Yeah.
Job defends himself and says, "What have I done? What have I done?" And obviously, you know, there's an element of simplification here. If Job's an actual physical human being,
Yeah.
then he has sinned in his life. But that's taken out of the equation of what we're told for a reason, which is we're to assume that he's correct. The Bible is kind of basically saying, let's assume that he's correct, because that makes this more difficult. Let's put this, let's test God on the highest difficulty setting that we can, and assume that he's correct and that there's no sin in his life. Because really, when it comes down to it, whether there is or isn't material, because we got the glimpse behind the curtain of why this happened, and it had nothing to do with the sin of Job. In fact, it had to do with the opposite. It had to do with his righteousness. Then we have God shows up, and what is God's answer to Job?
Where were you? Who do you think you are?
Yeah,
I mean, I hesitate to say it quite like that,
but that's kind of the way it's said,
yeah.
right?
I mean, basically, he says things exist a certain way, and I put them in motion, and give me an answer to where you were when I did such.
I find it interesting that at the end of it, Job is actually satisfied by that answer as well, by that response, because it's not really an answer
Right.
to what Job wants, but it is the response, and it's still satisfying to Job, even though it definitely is not the answer he was looking for.
Yeah, it's a very strange answer, and to modern readers, it's completely unsatisfying.
Yeah.
It's just basically God saying, "Look at the glory of the world, the universe I created. Look at the glory of it." how is that an answer for Job? What should we take as Christians from that answer?
Well, there's a huge amount of faith. I mean, back in Proverbs, if A, then B, you have to have some faith that that actually is true. And you can do it, and you can try it out, and it works most of the time, but sometimes it doesn't. Does that mean God is not in control, or he doesn't exist, or that the proverb is false? You know, we talked about how does our love... I mean, I could say, if the proverb is, plant your crops at this time, and you will reap a benefit. Well, I can do that thinking, well, God set this in place, and I love the fact that I get stuff. Or I can say, God's designed the world in a certain way. He's told me how to behave and act, and if I do it in obedience to him, I'll show that I love him. I don't always get the thing that I expect, but when I don't, that doesn't mean he isn't there, or that somehow it doesn't work, but I have to believe that I have faith that God is in control. Because if there is an interaction between God and Satan that maybe has happened infinite number of times for all of God's people, maybe we are experiencing that too in some way. Do I believe that God's in control when that happens? I think so.
Yeah.
But how would I know if I don't suffer and have a chance to be stretched, to have the response that Job does at the end, which is, God, you are right. You were in control that whole time, and I'm glad I'm still here to praise and worship you.
I think you'd mentioned how Ecclesiastes kind of looked at in the light of Proverbs just goes to show that the world is much more complex than it is painted to be in the book of Proverbs, and kind of at the end, that's what God kind of shows up and says is the world is beyond you, and all of reality is beyond you. However, it's not beyond me, and I'm still worthy of the fear, the reverence, and the love that you give me. And Job is completely satisfied with that answer.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's something in that answer also that points to the fact that in this complexity and in the things you don't understand, there is something beautiful to this, something glorious to this. And what's really kind of interesting to me is that it's kind of... The idea that the suffering is part of the world is something that God gets beat up with all the time. And sometimes we can say, understandably, but what God's argument seems to be in the book of Job is, well, there's some glory to this that you don't quite understand. And I think that the answer to that glory is found in the cross, where, there's going to be some times that you suffer for love, for me, but don't worry, I've suffered or will suffer for love for you, and in that there's actually some real glory. And if you kind of think about it, there really isn't anything more glorious in the world than that. I mean, if you can look at all kinds of really cool stuff out in space and all that, but the idea that love is willing to suffer for somebody else, it's hard to point to something greater than that. So it's interesting that in this wisdom literature, it's not all about the head; it's about the heart as well. And there's some reasons to think that knowing this wisdom literature and following it is the way to live in the promised land.